In the winter of 1870, a man entered deep into the Canadian North with his family for hunting. In the spring, however, only the man returned, and the story the man told afterward didn't seem right, prompting a search for the man's camp. When his camp was finally discovered, it would be one of the most gruesome scenes in Canadian history, so much so that it almost intermingled with legend. As a quick warning for the skeptics out there, you probably won't like how this story starts, but I promise you if you stick with it, it comes around. And as a warning, although the events are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are some of the most disturbing covered on the channel, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Deep in the frozen wilderness of the Canadian North, a legendary shadow lurks. One not of a man or a beast, but of something darker. Among the Cree and Algonquin peoples, stories of this shadow were whispered around campfires, told to children as warnings of what might happen when the human spirit succumbs to greed, desperation, or hunger. And these tales, passed down through generations, carried a mixture of fear and reverence for the entity they described. Known as the Wendigo, this shadow was more than a monster. It was more like a cautionary specter that feasted on the fragility of the human soul. Legends tell of its gaunt, towering form and blackened skin stretched thin over protruding bones. The Wendigo is also said to have moved on grotesque feet nearly a yard long with only a single toe, and its hideous fingers ended in claws that could disembowel a man with one swipe. Its voice is also said to have boomed and echoed like thunder, striking fear into even the bravest hunters. But more than its appearance, it was the Wendigo's insatiable hunger that defined it. It was said to have a craving for human flesh that drove it to commit acts so vile and unspeakable that they blurred the line between fiction and reality. It was said that those who encountered it faced not just a predator, but a force that feeds on the weakness of humanity itself. Now, the Wendigo is often spoken of in three distinct forms within Cree and Algonquin traditions. The first is of a superhuman monster that may or may not have once been human. The second is as a person possessed by the Wendigo's spirit, driven by its hunger to commit unspeakable acts. And lastly, the Wendigo is sometimes seen as a cultural symptom, a sort of psychological obsession compelling its victims to crave human flesh. Each of these interpretations adds to the legend, revealing the complexity and the fear it embodies. But in the end, they're all just a story, right? In the late 19th century, a Cree man named Swift Runner was equally respected and feared. He was a skilled hunter who stood at an imposing 6'3", and he was once the epitome of strength and resourcefulness, traits necessary to thrive in the unforgiving Canadian frontier. Much of Swift Runner's early life remains a mystery, but in the 1870s he had risen to prominence as the chief of a small band of Plains Cree. This band lived off the land's resources and traded furs for essentials like tea, flour, and guns at Fort Edmonton. And his reputation extended far beyond his own people too. In 1875, traders from the Hudson's Bay Company were so impressed by his intelligence and reliability that they recommended him to the Northwest Mounted Police as a trustworthy guide. For a time, it seemed like Swift Runner's skills and leadership could bridge the world of the Cree and the encroaching settlers. Beneath this promising exterior, however, was a darker side. Unfortunately, like many in the region, Swift Runner had been introduced to alcohol through trade, and its influence on him was devastating. He developed a taste for whiskey in particular, and anytime the liquor touched his lips, a metamorphosis would take place. When sober, Swift Runner was a man of considerable charm and competence, but when drunk, he became a terror. Stories began to spread of his violent outbursts, and his once respected name became synonymous with fear. His short tenure as a scout for the Mounted Police then ended in disgrace, and his downward spiral worsened. It was during this period of decline that Swift Runner's life intersected with the legend of the Wendigo. According to Cree tradition, the Wendigo's influence could seep into those weakened by desperation or moral corruption, and Swift Runner's first encounter with this darkness occurred years earlier during a hunting trip with a young boy deep in the forest. When the two ran out of food and starvation began, the boy died of hunger and Swift Runner consumed his remains. This act was unthinkable, and to some, it marked Swift Runner as vulnerable to the Wendigo's possession. And whether the monster was real or a manifestation of his guilt and despair, the shadow of this legendary being loomed over him from that moment on. By 1878, Swift Runner's decline had accelerated, and as his drinking worsened, his violent tendencies grew more pronounced, as did the whispers of the Wendigo's influence that followed him. Despite these ominous signs, however, half the time he remained a man of immense capability, and this contradiction made the events of that winter all the more shocking. As the cold winds of the season began to sweep across the northern wilderness late that year, Swift Runner and his family embarked on a hunting expedition deep into the Sturgeon River country. For generations, the Cree had relied on these trips to sustain them throughout the harsh months. Swift Runner led his wife Charlotte and their 6 children along with his brother and mother into the forest with hopes of returning with loads of meat and fur. It was a familiar custom and one that should have ensured their survival, but this particular winter was unforgiving. Game became increasingly scarce and the family's traps cut almost nothing. Day after day, they combed the snow-covered terrain in search of sustenance, but their efforts were in vain. Hunger then began to gnaw at them, and the desperation settled in like the frost creeping over their camp. They soon resorted to eating what little they could scavenge, including bark, roots, and eventually even the dried moose hide that served as their tent. As the weeks dragged on, survival became an increasingly difficult prospect, and the youngest of Swift Runner's children would succumb to starvation. However, grief-stricken but still clinging to hope, the family pressed on. Then one day, Swift Runner's brother and mother ventured further into the wilderness, determined to find game to hunt, only to never return. The loss of his brother and mother left Swift Runner and what remained of his family even more isolated. Trapped in this endless cold, their suffering deepened, and hunger does strange things to the mind. As the days blurred into nights, Swift Runner's thoughts grew darker. Soon, he began to dream of the Wendigo. In the spring of 1879, Swift Runner was the only member of his family to emerge from the forest. He arrived at the Oblate Mission in St. Albert with a story of unimaginable hardship. He told the priest that his entire family perished in the wilderness as one by one they had been claimed by starvation. As he recounted the tragedy, however, there were unsettling details he didn't seem to have answers for. Why had he been the only one to survive? And how was it that a man who endured such deprivation could appear to be so well fed? These questions lingered, but for now, the priest chose to believe Swift Runner and offered him shelter and prayers. But simultaneously, the shadow of the Wendigo approached even closer now, and the truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. Suspicion continued to build in the quiet halls of the Oblate Mission. While Swift Runner played the role of the grieving father, troubling inconsistencies haunted the minds of the priests he relayed the story to. And whispers from other Cree hunters hinted that starvation had not been so severe in the Sturgeon River country that winter. And to add to that, Swift Runner's appearance, which was healthy to the point of passing for robust, stood in stark contrast to the image of a man who had barely survived a harsh winter. These doubts eventually reached the mounted police, prompting a decision to investigate further, and Sergeant Richard Steele, a seasoned officer, was dispatched to St. Albert to confront Swift Runner. At first, Swift Runner stuck to his story, repeating his account of a family consumed by starvation, but his responses to pointed questions were evasive, and Richard sensed something was wrong. Swift Runner was then arrested, seemingly on general suspicion, and a police party was assembled to accompany him back to his winter camp in search for evidence. The journey there was arduous, with Swift Runner shackled and riding in a cart pulled by a horse. He initially guided the party along the trail to Sturgeon River, but as the days passed, it became clear that he was deliberately leading them astray. Police then grew increasingly frustrated and were unsure of how to proceed. Finally, one of the Métis scouts, George Washington Brazeau, suggested an unconventional tactic. One evening, George brewed up a potent mix of tea and chewing tobacco and left it to steep overnight. George said that this would be a strong medicine intended to loosen Swift Runner's tongue. And the next morning, after consuming the beverage, Swift Runner's demeanor changed completely. As the brew took hold, he grew more agitated and his defenses crumbled under the weight of interrogation. So with little choice left and apparently unable to continue being deceitful, Swift Runner agreed to lead the party on to the site of his camp. After more travel through the wilderness, the party came to a clearing that from a distance looked to be the location of a recently abandoned campsite, and it didn't take long for Swift Runner's story to begin collapsing. The party's very first find all but threw Swift Runner's initial account of what happened into complete falsehood. Draped over a few trees was the moose hide that was used to construct a tent, completely intact and not cut into pieces so it could be boiled for food like Swift Runner claimed. Then when they got closer to the campsite, they saw the remains of unspeakable carnage. Strewn across the ground were the skeletal remains of Swift Runner's family. 8 human skulls, fragments of bone, and scraps of clothing all scattered like debris. The femurs and other long bones had had their marrow extracted, and the skulls bore the signature marks of a sharp instrument. Then in the center of the camp, more boiled bones lay amid piles of ash with bits still clinging to them. And upon closer inspection, the remains were apparently found to display the unmistakable drag marks of human teeth. And one discovery in particular horrified the party. Among the remnants was a particularly small skull bearing the same marks as the others. The trunks of nearby trees were also smeared with greasy handprints, and an iron pot coated with fat sat discarded between some bushes. The scene painted a picture not of desperation but of calculated and repeated acts. When confronted with this evidence, Swiftrunner's facade disintegrated. Although he continued to claim that starvation had driven him to consume his family, his own well-fed appearance betrayed the darker truth. The Wendigo shadow, it seemed, had fully descended over the camp. With the gruesome evidence of the camp forever burned into their minds, the mounted police shackled Swiftrunner once again and brought him back to Fort Saskatchewan. The return journey was tense as the man the party now viewed as a monster sat silently in the cart with a complete lack of remorse in his eyes. Upon arrival at the fort, Swiftrunner was placed into a small interrogation room where the bones were set on the table in front of him, forcing him to confront the evidence. Initially, Swiftrunner again maintained a story of starvation and reiterated in a voice that was calm and collected. As the interrogation dragged on, however, he began to crack. When he was asked to identify the bones, he did so with chilling nonchalance, even picking one of them up before laughing and exclaiming, "This is my wife." The investigators were unnerved by this lack of emotion but continued to press him even further. Details of the horrific winter then began to emerge as Swiftrunner confessed that starvation had not driven him to his crimes, at least not at first. He spoke of falling ill in February of 1879 with his mind clouded by visions of the Wendigo. His dreams, he claimed, had turned dark and were filled with the whispers urging him to kill. He then recounted the fateful moment when hunger and madness overcame him. One morning, as the sun lay near the fire, Swiftrunner took his gun and shot him before descending on him to finish the job. In his confession, he admitted that his family was still alive at this point, but he chose to keep the true nature of the death a secret. For days, he fed on the remains, while the others knew nothing of what happened other than that he had passed away. As the weeks went on though, Swiftrunner's madness deepened. He described forcing another set of siblings to attack one another and having them prepare the remains afterward. Later, the youngest met an even more gruesome fate that won't be described here. But either way, one by one, each of them fell before they were consumed in the name of his unrelenting hunger. The investigators were obviously horrified by the level of detail in Swiftrunner's confession, and when asked why he had committed such atrocities, he blamed the Wendigo. The spirit, he insisted, had driven him to kill and feast upon his family, but obviously again, his claims of possession did little to absolve him in the eyes of police. They believed the crimes were not of supernatural influence, but instead of a man's descent into depravity. By the end of the interrogation, there was no doubt of Swiftrunner's guilt. He was then formally charged with the murder of his family, and his trial would begin on August 16, 1879 in Fort Saskatchewan. This marked the first murder trial in the history of Western Canada. When that day finally came, the courtroom was packed with settlers, Cree observers, and members of the Northwest Mounted Police, all eager to witness the proceedings as the ugly nature of the case had captured the region's attention. On the stand, Swiftrunner didn't deny the charges against him. He admitted to killing his wife and 5 of his children, although he continued to claim that his youngest son had died of starvation and that his mother and brother had disappeared into the wilderness. Witnesses then testified to the evidence found at the camp, and the prosecution emphasized the disturbing signs of calculated acts. They argued that Swiftrunner's actions went far beyond desperation, painting a picture of a man who embraced monstrosity. In his defense, Swiftrunner's lawyer attempted to invoke the Wendigo legend, suggesting that his client's actions were the result of possession. This argument, however, held little weight in the colonial legal system, which dismissed such claims as superstition. And this made the jury's task clear, and after 2 days of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict, finding Swiftrunner guilty. The judge then sentenced Swiftrunner to the gallows, set for December 20th. This ruling sent a clear message to the Cree community and the settlers alike that justice would be quick and unrelenting, even in the face of cultural differences. As the date approached, Swiftrunner reportedly confessed further details of his crimes to Father Hippolyte Leduc, who was the oblate priest who attended him during his imprisonment. According to this confession, Swiftrunner and his family had no luck hunting, so they first killed and ate their dogs. Then, while his brother and mother went out hunting, Swiftrunner stayed back with his wife and 5 children, but when his brother and mother didn't return, his wife took 5 of the children to go look for them. This left Swiftrunner alone with his son, who he admitted to attacking and consuming in the days after his wife and other children departed. While wandering around the forest afterwards, Swiftrunner ran into his wife and other children and told them that the boy that was left with him had died of starvation. The rest of the family then sadly accepted the news and returned to camp. Just a few days later though, Swiftrunner entered a state of unprovoked rage and shot his wife before attacking all but one of the others. With only one left, Swiftrunner and him feasted on the remains of Charlotte and the others for more than a week. Then as the weather started to warm up, hunting became a lot more of a viable prospect, but in the back of Swiftrunner's mind was the thought that the 7-year-old would one day tell the others of his father's atrocities. So rather than risk it, Swiftrunner finished and dealt with him the same way as the others. The priest would later describe these confessions as deeply unsettling and a blend of remorse and resignation. But despite his claims of Wendigo possession, Swiftrunner accepted a sentence with a stoic demeanor. Finally, on the frigid morning of December 20th, the North Saskatchewan River was frozen beneath a thick blanket of snow near the prison yard. In the biting cold, the temperature hovered around an unforgiving minus 40 degrees, freezing all but the fire which a group of about 60 Cree and Métis trappers huddled. They, along with the fort's 20-man garrison, had gathered to witness the end of Swiftrunner. On the scaffold platform, Father Leduc stood beside the condemned as the icy air seemed to amplify the weight of the moment. And although the priest shivered, sweat ran down his temples and back because of the tension of that day. Bound at the arms and legs, Swiftrunner maintained a calm demeanor. He examined the hastily constructed scaffold and stepped onto the trapdoor with a surprising, almost childlike cheerfulness. And before the sentence was carried out, he addressed the crowd at the priest's urging. He thanked the mounted police for their kindness during his incarceration and expressed regret for his actions before turning to the executioner and scolding him for making him wait so long in the bitter cold. When it was clear that he was done speaking, the lever was pulled and the trapdoor was opened in front of a silent audience. Swiftrunner's execution marked the culmination of a tale that straddled the boundary between myth and reality. To some, he was a man driven to madness by hunger and isolation, but to others, he was the embodiment of the Wendigo, a legend came to life in the unforgiving wilds of the Canadian North. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Also, in case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.